Welcome to folks online, and we've got you may not see online, we've got a capacity crowd here in the room, which I'm not surprised. Given our speaker, I want to begin actually with some thank yous. First, a thank you to Daria, who brought this event together very much at the last minute, at my fault in terms of setting it up at the last minute. Thank you, Daria, for this, and to my colleague Topher McDougall, who oversees the Crock-Pot series. An apology that I'm wearing this thing. I've got the sniffles. I woke up with the sniffles this morning, and I felt you all would prefer I not share those with you. So I'm sorry if it's a little bit muffled. Throwback to the COVID days, sadly. Thank you for your patience. It is my extreme honor and privilege to welcome our speaker, Professor Richard Joseph, who's been a longtime friend and mentor of mine, and is really a towering figure in the African studies field. Those of us who have been studying Africa for a long time are no strangers to difficult times and to difficult moments. And looking at the arrival of the second Trump administration, after President Trump in his first administration had referred to the continent as, quote, African shitholes, we were not, expecting any kind of sort of major African initiative out of this new administration, to say the least. Though interestingly enough, colleagues at USAID at the time, because Washington was so uninterested in Africa, found that they were able to get a lot happening under the radar because there was simply no White House interest at the time. We're in a very different world now, where USAID has been shuttered for the moment and is likely to be severely downsized in whatever form it comes back. The U.S. Institute of Peace has been shuttered. The National Endowment for Democracy has been shuttered. And our industry in general is shifting and adjusting. And we had at a time where just today, the author Stephen Levitsky, who talks about the fall of democracies and how democracies fall, says that the United States has indeed moved into the position of being what he calls a competitive authoritarianism. So democracy is under siege worldwide. And we live in a world where we cannot depend upon American leadership, as problematic as it always has been in terms of the democracy front, on these issues like we once did. So it's a whole new playing field to try to think about governance issues on the African continent and of course, American foreign policy engagement with those. And I cannot think of anybody better than Professor Joseph to sort of help us try to untangle all these terrible, difficult threads we're all trying to untangle at the moment and sort of navigate through. So allow me to, Richard, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read your biography really quickly for folks. I think it's important that folks know, maybe folks online may not know some of your background. Richard has taught at Emory University, Dartmouth College, UCLA up the road, University of Ibadan in Nigeria, University of Khartoum in Sudan. He's held research fellowships at Harvard, Boston University, MIT, the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex in the UK, in Norway, in France, and other places. He's devoted his scholarly career to the study of politics and governance in Africa, with a special focus on democratic transitions, state building and state collapse, and conflict resolution. He directed the African Governance Program at the Carter Center from 1988 to 1994, and coordinated election missions in Zambia, Ghana, and peace initiatives in Liberia. He has been a longtime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including a Rhodes Scholarship, a Kent Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2002 and 2003, he had visiting fellowships at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the National Endowment for Democracy, and he was a Fulbright scholar in France and a Fulbright professor in Nigeria. Richard also had a penchant for helping young scholars by co-authoring with them at key times in their career, for which I am forever grateful. So I introduce and I hand over to Richard Joseph. Welcome, Richard.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. Wonderful. This is a wonderful institution, and I just hope that you said, we just given the award. It's the best. campus in the United States. He said, well, how about Dartmouth? We always used to claim that. But anyway, you're way about it.
For a lot more than that.
Absolutely, this time of the year. All right. All right, so welcome, to all of you. This is an auspicious day for many reasons. First of all, it's VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, marking the end of World War II. It's also the day in which a new pope has been announced. But I've been thinking, of this moment. You said that this is, and so many people who have responded to me, are really, they're going to be online, or those who are not able to do so will be, receiving the link on it. So for many, many people, I assure you, this is a moment that they welcome the fact that, things have worked out and I'm able to come forward and do my best with this topic. This morning I awoke, Roger Cohen writes on European affairs in the New York Times, when he said, never could I imagine less than a year ago, this was VE Day last year, that so much dear to us could unravel so fast. And it turns out, and this message was quoted in the announcement that was produced for this event, a colleague of mine, a young colleague of mine, I don't name him here, but he will be named in the follow-up to this. When he wrote to me, this was on February 17th, and he said, welcome back from your trip. I just returned from Nigeria and the UK, and I had a lot of exciting things to report. But he said, well, what he really looks forward to is talking about what he called the total onslaught. And he used terms just like Roger Cohen, namely the values and beliefs, and used this word dear to me, how they have been, ravaged in this short space of time. So if you can imagine, I had come back and now had to make the shift from this very, very optimistic mode I was in from that trip to dealing with what was happening to the US. But it's even more than that, because over the years I have had colleagues say to me, when are you going to come back? And including those who know me, in my student days. I've gone through stages of being a scholar activist, and a little later on, because of policy roles, I began calling myself a scholar practitioner. But I'll share with you a new name that has been given to me. But anyway, so the sense was, oh, Richard, they'll talk about experiences I've had, and, my sister Angela, who is here, she, finally got me to, to do an interview with her on my time with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi. And I'm a very reluctant interviewer, but she succeeded and she has the link, but it gives you a little sense of some of my involvement. But anyway, one of my promises hopefully will come, not hope, I have to do it, will come through, namely start doing some writing about these experiences. All right, there is so much that we're hearing and seeing, people trying to make sense of what is going on. In fact, I just read about Isabel Allende, the novelist, who said, it's almost impossible to be able to make sense of something like this when it is happening. But anyway, Ben Rhodes wrote a column. Ben Rhodes, he is, analyst. He worked in the Obama, White House, and speechwriter, and so on. But he had a column in the Times, New York Times, on April 31st, and I think Ben Rhodes is the closest to where I am. All right. And he mentioned Franklin Roosevelt. Bettina will be able to tell you, as I'm, every so often as I'm trying to make sense of this, I have to go back to FDR. And Ben Rhodes, he said that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president, expanded America's relationship with the world that remade both. Just a wonderful sentence. It expanded America's relationship with the world that remade both. But with FDR, there was a dual transformation. There was a domestic and international. In response to the Great Depression, the FDR administration remade the state's relationship to society before taking that republic to war in Europe and the Pacific. Now, I could assure you that I have had different stages of my career. I've been very fortunate, but considerable amount of attention in political theory and philosophy. In fact, that's how I saw myself when I started my graduate studies. But also at times, you know, I became something of a social historian and on and on. And I will be calling on a lot of those experiences I have had, you know, in really helping us make sense of what's going on. And especially, you know, where do we go from here? Every American presidency before Trump has worked within the FDR social contract, narrowing it or widening it, but never repealing it. And if you know about FDR when he first came in, and with the Supreme Court, it's votes against his legislation until he kept at it, even threatened that he was going to have the Supreme Court, widen it and so on, and then finally they saw the light. And his legislation, he didn't do it like this person we have in Washington right now with all of these things. I mean, most of it was through legislation. All right, but today American communities, one after another, are seeing the state redraw and withdraw the commitments. These include fundamentals of the rule of law, due process, and constitutional democracy. After almost 6 decades of focusing mainly on African issues, I am compelled to return to the American project. Professor Moses Ochonu of Vanderbilt University, and by the way, I can tell you a lot of messages from individuals. I'm not quoting any of those because I also hear from former officers of the US government, right? But Professor Moses Ochonu of Vanderbilt, he said, as a scholar doer, so that is a new name for me now, as a scholar doer whose life work gives him a unique experiential and intellectual perspective on this most difficult issue of our time. Emeritus Professor Nelson Classfield of Dartmouth College, one of my dearest and closest colleagues, wrote me about today's seminar, quote, "It is absolutely the right topic to think about hard now." Let me repeat that. It is absolutely the right topic to think about hard now. Okay? Before I go on, I have some acknowledgements. Professor Darren Q, the lovely guy. Wonderful work, but he's also a lovely guy. And you know, I was so glad to hear his appointment here, and also it's also to the credit of the school. Sarah Wu, who helped with the arrangements. But a warm recognition to Professor Egosa Osage, former student of mine. And that's one of the things that I can really look back on, you know, these young people at different stages, starting from the classroom to their early arrival and so on. He's Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. And we work together in the creation of what is now called the Richard Joseph Learning Center at the Institute in Nigeria, where I gave a collection of my books, almost about like half of my library, and we had a great opening there on February 7th. Sincere thanks for opportunities to a number of people. I've been reflecting on something I call Africa Reimagined. And I love to work with creating, little, titles that really catch something. It happens to be Arima, where I was born, and it also stands for Africa Reimagined. But I also want to include Scott Taylor. I'm not going to go into the details, but at Boston University for another former student, Miles Young, who is the warden of New College in Oxford, one of my Oxford colleges, Professor Toyin Falola of the University of Texas, Dr. Patrick Okibo of Nextia, and these are all people who have hosted me to share my ideas. And you will see, go online and you'll find some of them. And including the Northwestern Emeriti Organization. But a special shout out to Professor Karine Ramondi in France. And she told me she was going to try to listen in. So hello, Karine. But this is for her and the members of this commission that was established by President Macron of France. And I would have loved to be able to show you all this report, but it's 1,000 pages. It will be translated into English, and then there'll be a special version made. But this is one of the most extraordinary reports and publications having to do with Africa and Europe, and in this specific case, France. And it also happens to be, the work that I did a good 4 decades ago, and is now extended into this incredible report. All right, there are 4 themes to my presentation. First, the onslaught, and I really don't have to tell those who are present what this onslaught happens to be. The second is Africa's post-colonial predicament, right? And there is, and maybe one of these days I'll get it done, but his name is Stanislav Andreski, sociologist, who wrote a book called The African Predicament. In 1968, it was the same year I started the study of Africa. And it's not a much read book. The title alone will give it away. He calls it on the pathology of modernization. But Andreski's book is one where you can take a lot of Andreski, a lot of pathologizing language, and there's some core notions in Andreski about the African predicament that we live with to the present. There's the Arima Project, like I said, which is my thinking of my ideas of what could be done. I mean, you look across the continent and all of the issues are there and how it should be addressed, what could be done. And then finally, as a result of this exercise I've been involved in for the last couple of months, what I call strategies for collaborative engagement. Okay. United States relations with Africa have been a bipartisan concern for several decades. In the mid-1950s, President Dwight Eisenhower recognized that African diplomats were being posted to an America that was still considerably segregated by race. So he reached out to them. Ardent supporters of peace, democracy, and development initiative in Africa have included Republicans as well as Democratic legislators in Congress. Republican President George W. Bush enacted a program with significant impact in Africa, namely PEPFAR, stands for the President Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. He also championed one of the most innovative development initiatives, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And like all of these, we wiped off the slate. Where are we today? On April 20th, a draft document for a presidential executive order on foreign policy was published by the New York Times. It was dismissed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio as fake news. However, many of the sweeping changes, and I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a lot of details. By the way, this statement is going to be made available. In fact, I'm creating a site and so on. So everything will be documented, footnoted, and everything else. Many of the sweeping changes mentioned in that draft have subsequently been implemented. In addition to the dismantling of government or government-supported institutions with high levels of engagement in Africa, such as D&Q has mentioned, and they include organizations launched by President Ronald Reagan, right? Like the National Endowment for Democracy. And in fact, one of the most extraordinary talks about the importance of promoting democracy was made by Ronald Reagan in the White House, and you could access it. Africa has been downgraded, however, under the current administration as a region of national interest and concern. I encourage you to read the statement of April 22nd, signed by over 200 American national security and foreign service diplomats, called The Assault on American Democracy, a Call to Action. It portrays the harm already inflicted. And I already mentioned this message I got from a colleague, calling it a total onslaught. He was not exaggerating, nor was the Right Reverend Marian Goody, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., when she added to her sermon of January 21st, a call for mercy. The four-term senator of Arizona, Lisa Murkowski, has since admitted living with fear. Profound anxiety pervades many of our communities, including colleges and universities, and also many homes. We are in this together and must collaborate to find pathways forward. What's going on? By the way, I did plan to play for you Marvin Gaye. But I knew time will be short, so you could always call it up and listen to it. By the way, not only have I listened to Marvin Gaye, but people who know me, I tend to sing. And so at my last birthday party, I actually sang a calypso. I'm not going to do it now. But I heard a lot of calypso and I remember it. But I've been singing freedom songs. And so as I'm doing the dishes, I will certainly start singing freedom songs. So maybe as part of what's going forward, I will be able to do so. You will hear in that video that Angela did with Mrs. Hamer, that Mrs. Hamer would sing. She'd be talking, all of a sudden she would start singing. I'd start singing. So anyway, part of the struggle. Okay, last fall, a group in which I participate held an in-person retreat. Along with our usual topics, we had a check-in about the contentious political situation. One participant thought that the concerns were overblown. He had confidence in our constitutional democracy and especially the separation of powers and the independent judiciary. Now, I didn't want to debate him, so I simply said, citizenship. Just on the spur of the moment. What really crossed my mind was the French word citoyen. And those of you who know your French history would understand what citoyen refers to. And in fact, the moment when I felt like, I think we're going to be okay, it's going to be difficult in America, was going through, the town, I live near to it now, called Wilmette, Illinois. And there on the corner was a group of people protesting. Ordinary citizens with their signs protesting. I really should have taken a photograph and noted the date. But I stopped for a second, and there it was. The people were saying no, in their own way. And I felt at that moment, we're going to be okay. So, the core values of the US as a republic, engraved in the national anthem, Pledge of Allegiance, and many hallowed songs, are now acquiring feet and walking on the ground. I used to teach a lot of political theory, so the German philosophers, Hegel and Fichte, this idea that, ideas can acquire feet and walk on the ground. Americans of all walks of life, all socioeconomic strata, all heritages and philosophies, except the one now prevailing, are seeing the fundamentals of American statehood and democracy shredded. Most are not convinced that greater efficiency will follow the evisceration of many institutions and programs. Now, that's one of the words that I have been using for myself. I have many of them. I have quite a list of words to talk. Now, but this word I first saw in print in a quote from Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York. As citizens, we have an equal right and responsibility to ask what is going on, to discuss it with our family members and associates, and to act according to our consciences. Now, implications for Africa. I first used the word impact regarding the consequences for Africa of the substantial changes being enacted in US policies and institutions. I then realized that we will not know the impact until much later, perhaps too late. More accessible are insights about the implications of these radical changes. Tens of thousands of individuals here and abroad have been involved in implementing American policies concerning Africa. Some of my colleagues contend that the withdrawal of US support will create space for African initiatives. It should also compel, so it is thought, African governments and others to take responsibility for addressing persistent problems. Now, I share some of this thinking, but not all of this thinking, because some of it I think is just being complacent. What has been carried out by the new American administration is so sweeping and so swift that the damage is likely to be much greater than we realize. I have a section here. I'm not going to read it through because I had to get a little bit academic. In fact, a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal talked about the same thing, called it a scramble for Africa. But it has to do with Africa in relation to external powers, right? The term we use is extraversion. And that notion is the relationship of African countries with external powers and then their involvement with the continent. And so what we're dealing with now is the number of powers that are involved with Africa. I mean, you would know about Russia, you will know about China, but also you have a lot of Gulf states. And at this moment, the United Arab Emirates, I mean, what is going on with the United Arab Emirates? I mean, there's a lot of focus, for example, actually got to the International Criminal Court and things of what's going on in Sudan. But moving on, the US has pursued an all-of-government approach to engagement with Africa, right? There's been progress over time, extraordinary. Even, there was a leader summit not too long ago having to deal with that. And you would have heard of this. And this means that agencies across the breadth of the US government have increased their Africa-related portfolios. Second, there has been increased government efforts to engage African Americans in African affairs. Descendants of Africa is a term that now appears in many contexts. Grants intended to widen the pipeline of African Americans entering the US Foreign Service. Of course, the US Foreign Service itself is being, right, whatever. It's not what it used to be. But also, it also means that innovative efforts like these are suddenly squelched, right? Thirdly, a term with which we are familiar regarding the protection of wildlife, namely extinction. I first saw that term being used, and it was used regarding NASA. And it was saying that when you have projects of NASA that are just suddenly eliminated, well, those projects are connected to other projects, right? So the implications go beyond some of those specifics. And immediately I can see that in terms of, Africa, food and health programs, and how they are related to, processes here in the US, including training of health professionals, agricultural workers, and so on. How do we cope with challenges of this magnitude and complexity? Now, an initiative can be started looking at what it means for programs with significant African content to be suddenly eliminated or curtailed. Now, there are persons who have this information, this knowledge. There are thousands of them, and many of them we have interacted with. In some cases, the entire institution, we mentioned USIP for one of them, in which they work, like the Woodrow Wilson Institution, I mean, it goes on, has been shuttered. Now, these people are bruised emotionally and in other ways, while operations to which they gave devotees individuals they recruited and mentored overseas are cut adrift, and there's little they can do for them. You know, and I'm putting in a lot of my specific experiences, but you know, I just remember from Liberia, being involved in Liberia, and what it meant for people who work not only for the US government, for other entities. When you suddenly have developments that are taking place like these, they just cut adrift. Okay? Now, most of these voices have been silenced. However, their knowledge must be collated before it is forever lost. Now, responses. We need hard and strategic thinking. My colleague Nelson Casfrey mentioned about hard thinking, and this is hard work, this kind of thinking, right? But also strategic thinking, and this was very much from colleagues who had worked in the US government service. You know, one saying, look, you know how long it takes to build these institutions, these programs up, and they could be so quickly eliminated, right? It took, and you know, once they're gone, they're gone. How are you going to put these things back together? You know, they ain't coming back, quite frankly, most of them. Now, I would add, in addition to hard and strategic, we need collaborative thinking, because many talents, bodies of knowledge, and technical capacities must be tapped. Now, I go over my work in terms of my introduction to African studies. I mentored Andreski and so on, and all of it. But I have to skip over some of that, you know, and obviously be available in written form. The dismantling of US institutions and programs intended to serve Africa has heightened the need to address persistent challenges, right? And this is a point to consider. The problems we have in Africa did not start with this administration. And by the way, he didn't only say shitholes, he said Hudson shitholes, all right? You know, this is just fact checking to show that, yes, we know exactly what he has said, okay? Dismantling of Africa, all right, the persistent challenges. And I mentioned about the France-Cameroon Historical Experience. And I mentioned about the Richard Joseph Learning Center, and I'm hoping to see this example of saying that we can create these very important contributions to making what we have so abundantly available. One of the books that kept in my mind often as I was working on this is Vincent Harding's book, There Is a River, The Black Struggle for Freedom in America. And in fact, I actually have a photograph with Vincent Harding. I have a lot of photographs, so these ones. And that is a very important compendium, because there is a Black struggle, right, for freedom in America. But the Black people, they were Africans. And the struggle in Africa is very much connected to that Black struggle that Vincent Harding is talking about, thinking of it in that kind of a way. All right, let me try to end with some points. The first points that I have made, and I'm going to set my time. So I'm setting my time, stopping time at 1:45. So that gives me 7 minutes. Okay. In my work, and Darren and others will be very familiar with this, the key deficit in post-colonial Africa has been governance. And in fact, when I met with former President Carter in February 1988, and reached out to me in terms of him setting up the Carter Center, and in that conversation with President and Mrs. Carter, and by the way, again, I've had a lot of work with President Mr. Carter. Fortunately, I have a lot of documentation, a lot of photographs on that experience. But so he asked me at one point, what did I consider the most important issue in Africa? And without a moment hesitation, I said governance. He said, what do I understand by it? And I shared with him what I understood by it. So he said, well, why don't you come and do it here? And that was really the start of the African Governance Program conversation. By the way, Carter also mentioned to me when he asked me about where I was born, I said, I was born in Trinidad. And he said, yeah, he visited, Trinidad, he's a naval officer, submarine. Because we have a base here, Chagaramas. And I had a spot I skipped over because my connection with the US started very early in my life, because my father worked on that base in Chagaramas. And that goes back to Lend-Lease, FDR, and all the rest. All right, so I have proposed on a number of occasions. One time I thought something will come of it. There's an African Economic Association, a meeting where I gave the keynote address in December 2017 and so on. And I said, we need a task force, to take this forward. Anyway, the African Development Bank is choosing a new leader this year, and I hope that she will really take this up. The second is enterprise, not aid. And this was something, when Dean Q happened to mention to me, they're interested, well, that's right down my way, the importance of enterprise. And in fact, it turns out one of the publications you referred to, there was a publication we did entitled Smart Aid for African Development. And one of the contributors to that volume is no other but Dean Q. And his chapter was Democratizing Donor Civil Society Relations. Very pertinent, right? Okay, 3, the most perceptive scholars have recognized the centrality of institutions in political and economic life. Here, I won't go into our details, because again, I don't want to make this too academic, but, Francis Fukuyama, in Stanford, in his book, he wrote, institutions we know are essential, but where do they come from? And that whole issue about institutions, something that again comes up over and over, both from my experiential, involvement in Africa, but also, as an academic and teaching. But again, I think there are great opportunities for us today to be able to focus on those questions, and especially now with, what is called artificial intelligence. I call it, my term is auxiliary intelligence. I see that being able to help them. All right, the next point is the hard work. And I call it the hard work of tough love. Tough love, right? And when I look at the continent, it's tough love. It's not just, bleeding heart love, it's tough love. You mentioned the University of Khartoum, Sudan. You could well imagine that was my first teaching job in Africa, right? And not only, of course, Sudan as a country basically doesn't exist anymore. And of course, the University of Khartoum, it's gone on and on. But anyway, I have a list of a dozen items here of tough love, and which one I go over with you, but anyway, they are there, and we have to address them. We also have to ask about the positive developments in many African countries and how they can be nurtured. I told you I just came back from this trip, and Professor Egosa Osage, when he gave his annual lecture on television, he referred to the fact that, yes, Professor Joseph, when he gave his talk, 1991, when my Nigeria book was published, and, there's this moment that many people remember, which is the headline of stories saying, Professor Prize for Nigeria. But it was this moment when I was thinking, so there's this photograph of me. So anyway, Professor Osage, he said, well, in my talk, I talk about, well, we've gone from Professor Prize to professors beginning to smile. Yeah. And it had to do because of some of the developments that I was seeing. Professor Bangura, in fact, he's a longtime colleague. And from his recent trip to Nigeria, he said, there were 3 positive things I took away from this trip to Nigeria, right? The first one, he said, was the agro-industrial enterprises that Nigeria now producing, you know, and we always talked about this in Holland, but anyway, he said about cashless transactions, point-to-point sales. And the third one was about the entertainment industry. And this is, you know, and what that represents and how that has gone global, right? Now, on my basis of my most recent trip, I was just in Abuja and in Lagos, you know, the former capital city, the current one. And I could also tell you about things that, hey, wait a second, I'm seeing things. And one of them was infrastructural development. But anyway, so we have to find ways of those positive things, how we can do so, especially through this notion I'm telling you about collaborative engagement. Okay, a few more points. The fundamental resource for Africa also turns out to be one of its greatest challenges, and that's demography, right? That, as you all know, Africa is the fastest growing continent, and it not only fastest growing, but its youth population, one of the fastest growing in the world in terms of a proportion of that, right? And so this challenge of having to really meet the needs and demands and so on, for me, I'm focusing very much on education. I'm focusing very much on the young people's not only their right to an education, but their right to know what's happened. In fact, I've had somebody, I remember a colleague I was talking to him about Ethiopia. I'm talking about with meetings with President Carter, with the former Mengistu, and him saying to me, Richard, we have a right to know what took place behind those closed doors, and on and on and on, but a right to know, and especially for young people. And so I believe that, you know, the opportunity to be able to reach out through education and to create opportunities for young people, all right, to do so. I'll give a call out to a young woman. Her name is Milayo and Daramola. I know she'll be listening to me. Hello. And I met her high school. I gave a talk in Nigeria, I think it was 2017. And as I'm giving the talk, it was another keynote address. And I looked, and there was a group of school children in their uniforms. And the last time, you know, I sit behind my brother here from Grenada. The last time I saw something like this was in Grenada. Because I hear it's in George's University. And we're launching an Institute of Caribbean International Studies. And there were these, you know, the teachers had brought the young people to come and listen. And so here was a group of Nigerians. So I went straight to that group after the talk. I'm there with the big old guys, you know, the big guys and so on. I headed straight to them. But anyway, she was one of those students. She reached out to me afterwards. Anyway, she's the first Arima intern now, the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. All right? And those young people, and in fact, we had a talk with next year, and she came online to ask a question, and her question was, you know, Professor, what are the specific steps that are required to break free from prebendalism? And prebendalism is a notion I'm associated with in terms of the misuse of government offices. And so here I am, I had to tell Patrick Okibo, yes, I said, that's the young woman I've been talking about. Well, she is indicative of people, they want, you know, they've seen it, you know, look at all of this, you know, and I always think of Greta Thunberg, right? The Norwegian, the Scandinavian, you know, you have failed us, right? That generation is saying you have failed us, right? And they're really challenging, you know, through their protests. All right, so my conclusion. And my conclusion, again, you know, you see me mentioning two things. I mentioned, you know, Arthur Ashe, and someone who, you know, shared with me this phrase, and we'll have to let him know. And it was, you know, and start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I have, ever since I heard that, I've kept. And the second one is that we must expand knowledge and build solutions. Not expand knowledge, you know, in some hermetic way and so on, you know, but really expand knowledge and create solutions. Finally, Ben Rose gets the last word, as he did the first one. And I'll quote him. We now have more in common with people in other countries living under corruption, autocracy, and oligarchy. I repeat, We now have more in common with people in other countries living under corruption, autocracy, and oligarchy. This can be a moment when we can find a new kind of solidarity with others who have been through versions of what we are now experiencing. So my point is, paradoxically, in disengaging from the world challenges and from our own constitutional principles, we are in fact adopting familiar systems of governance. And so Arima can stand for America reimagined, not just Africa reimagined. Thank you.
I've got a first question for Richard. I want to say, we'll take some questions inside here, but also from online. Dari, do we want to have folks type in the questions and you read them? Is that the best way?
Yeah, they can send them in the chat.
Okay, great. So folks watching online, if you want to put your questions into the chat box there, and Dari will read them as well. So we'll get to those in just a moment. So think a bit about the questions you might want to ask Richard. I'll start with the first one on governance, and maybe I feel like the Daramola's insistence on concrete steps.
Right.
We need to do honor to her point. Let's get a little more concrete about governance in particular.
Right.
I think we both and many in our field have written about that good governance and democracy requires some sort of a viable opposition.
Right.
Some sort of, in the American context, we talk about checks and balances, but we're really thinking about countervailing power sources in society in order to make sure there is not just simply one center that can do what it wants. That, in essence, is sort of the definition of democracy. The US support for governance has never been huge, but it has been significant, and particularly it was focused especially on civil society across the continent. And again, it was never massive amount of money, but it was often enough where there was some independent civil society voice outside of the civil society actors that were supported by the, as you call them, the prebendal sort of, oligarchs in the system who sort of pay to play for civil society groups.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, creating at least some sort of space for some countervailing power against sort of the center. I'm thinking now that, USAID at least shuttered for the moment, if, and certainly sort of the governance budgets I'm not looking to them to come back anytime soon. And with China, not having any particular interest in sort of democratic development on the continent, you mentioned the Gulf states, Russia, there's really only the Europeans and at a state level that are sort of interested in democracy in Africa in any way. If African civil society doesn't have this sort of external support, funding support for it, where do you see it going? Many of them presumably will sort of find their big man, so to speak, client that will support them to some extent. And each oligarch will have their civil society supporters is one model. But I'm hearing you talk about sort of with the Nigerian progress that you saw with infrastructural development, and you also talked about enterprise, not aid.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing some other sort of ways for finding political space with civil society or beyond civil society. So this is really a question about, where is democracy going in Nigeria, but sorry, in Africa, Nigeria, if you want to talk. But really focused in on the sort of civil society dimension here. Are these sort of pockets of space where the first steps towards some sort of African democratic renaissance can be born in there?
Okay, let me go quickly, and thank you, Aaron. Excellent questions. Very quickly with responses. First of all, Professor Casfield, in his reply to me, he said, we have to go back now, and he says the first one he mentioned was self-reliance, going all the way back to Julius Nyerere. In other words, it was ideas that you had coming out of the whole struggle for independence. They weren't coming out from independence, and he said, "Help us," It wasn't, it was, let's, be getting out of colonial rule, and here are the things we're going to do, and so. But I'm just saying the thinking in Africa was really about agency. And I mentioned, in fact, I'm going to do a follow-up to what I did on Cameroon and France, be saying that, look, what happened in Cameroon and so on was was the idea of agency, right? That France came in and so on, here is France and French and all of the rest. So I believe that this is a moment, and but a lot of the thoughts of my colleagues have been saying, when, well, if the US said da 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 da, America first, da, 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 so, and for many of them is like, well, hey, listen, well, whatever you've done, thank you very much. So there is that strong feeling. The second one is, we've got the young people. Bear in mind, Nigeria's had two, let me just take Nigeria. I live in Nigeria, so it's a fact of life. But, two significant major protests. The first one was End SARS, and SARS was a special police unit, right, of things that this instrument of the state. And the second was End Bad Governance. I mean, it's like, it has reached the level of street knowledge, not just us academics talking about this, okay? So I believe that there is a real feeling there. And then, the issues of enterprise. So, and the other thing about this, I'm really going to be, putting together my thoughts, on this. In fact, as always, have an acronym always shows up. So I always have, I call it ALPS right now. It's for the Arima Learning Project, which is what it is, strategies for collaborative engagement, acronym ALPS. Because it's not just the US was involved in Africa. In all of my experiences of direct invasion in the continent, especially a lot of countries, there were European partners. They've gone away. Obviously, they've got issues and so on, right? So bear in mind that just because the US is pulled out, doesn't mean that all of these other countries, Holland, and all the Scandinavian countries and others and so on, have also decided we're pulling out. Right? So the operation of that collaborative. But also, let me just end with this though, is I really feel enterprise. I mean, I've always said, I know Asians are and so on, but Africans are the most enterprising people that you could imagine, right? And the opportunity to really bring enterprising drive to a lot of things. There's a part that I had you had to skip over, which is an analysis saying that we really go into the situation in the global economy which has a slowing down and the impact that it's having on certain areas. And that impact in those areas is where, in fact, it's really generating a lot of these conflicts that we're seeing, right? Because the engines of development, right, have not been there. And aid has not kind of been a substitute for it. So, if I take off my coat and this is my dealing with the onslaught, I mean, what you'll be seeing are that somebody who's saying, all right, finally, I think, people have got it, right? And we need to be able to sort of try as best to deal with all of this stuff that's going on and really connect with some of those dynamics. And you have, I mean, your career has been so much about that. Yeah.
Questions from inside the house? Somebody want to start us off?
I just wanted to say, just a couple of observations about how transnational your lecture is, and as well, because of course, when you mentioned Trinidad, the immediate memory that comes to my mind were the Jose ceremonies that were conducted by the Gujarati Shias. My grandfather is from Zanzibar, and he was the imam for the Gujarati Shias there. And my uncle taught Arabic at University of Khartoum. His name was Sultan al-Marashi. I don't know if you ever met him. But I just appreciated how when we're talking about Africa, the minute that you mentioned Trinidad, you reminded me of just how transnational.
Yes.
The subject you study is when we're speaking of, and of course, the African diaspora in the US as well. So that was it. It was just an observation.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And while I was making this presentation, one of the points about, I can't make all the things, but I was going to say, listen, even though I'm talking about Africa, you could translate it to whatever area of the world really, that, it's very translatable to a lot of it. And then the other one is, I use the term global Africa. I use the term for myself, because myself a global African. As I think many of us
I mean, there's an Atlantic Africa, and then there's also an Indian Ocean Africa. There's the Africa of the monsoon winds, and that explained my father's life in Zanzibar, as well as the Gujaratis who came to Zanzibar as well.
No, yeah, and again, we can't do it, but the African diaspora, I mean, it's so hugely important in the United States, hugely important in so many countries now, that you really, that you have that. And as I'm talking to you, it's like I've had to spend so much of my time, sort of having to deal with this onslaught, all this negativity, all right, and so on. And I'm just want to find a way now that I could just, push that aside and just get back to some of this dynamism that is there, and taking. Thank you.
Or do you want to take one question from
Yeah, we do
online?
have a few things online. I'll just go in order. So what do you consider the most pressing or urgent issue concerning your subject matter of the day? And how would you recommend the issue is addressed in a meaningful way?
All right, so the most important issue, now that I've finished run through my talk, is, and I said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I think it comes back to, what can I do? Where do I come in? What am I, all right? And in my case, it's really about things that I have talked about doing. I'm obviously not getting younger, and I'm getting older, but the aging is slowing down because of the energy that all of this is generating. But anyway, so the most important thing in terms of, and I think each person asking themselves or herself, what, and in my case, it's, I'm used to teaching, so, A, B, C, D, and E. Here's my A, B, C, D, and E. A, my archives, right? Many years, a lot of documentation, and making, that available, making it accessible, that is substantial. The second one is it's books. I've seen what has happened to libraries, actual material, access to it. And I've started that process, with this learning center. And I'm hoping I'm going to put it online. We're going to put it, and I'm saying, here's the model, here's how it's been done, and here it is. You can do it. We're able to do it, right? And the second one I call Chronicles. And Chronicles is and that is for the writing that I need to do. All right, on each one of these major areas of involvement. I have not written about my Carter Center experiences. I have not written that second book on Cameroon. I have not written that second book on Nigeria, right? And then I have not working about my personal story. I have to do that. And then finally, again, really education. It's a crime. I mean, I said that in one of my interviews. I said it's a crime. The out of school children is a term they use in Nigeria. I mean, it's a crime. We have millions of children. When you look at each one of those conflicts, there's no schooling. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. I'm not an Africanist, unfortunately, but I really appreciated your presentation. My own field is mostly peace building and international development and peace and security. Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned the topic that I wanted to raise, right, which is conflicts in Africa. When I was with the United Nations, it was during a period where the conflicts were settling down, and we were hoping that there would be a peaceful era in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Right. But we now see resurgence of very difficult conflicts, yes, in Africa. So what are your thoughts on where they go and how they're related to governance issues and development issues, and most importantly, the self-reliance? Because so many of the conflicts in Africa were either caused by external interventions or mediated by external interventions.
Well, I said hard work, and some of that work is beyond hard. and and I'll just put out, some thoughts with you. I mean, I quickly was thinking of, Sudan, and so thinking of the Congo, right? Just recently reading the next year, updates about Nigeria and the conflicts that we have, the insecurity that we have, the Sahelian states. And you're right, we went through a period when, whether it's through democratization, whether through attention to a lot of the conflicts and so on, we really felt like we were moving in a certain direction. Sadly to say, I feel like, why there are, positivities, the trend is just not good. And the, the thinking, the new ways of engagement is one in which no one, I remember Professor Crawford Young, a dear colleague of ours, would say that, and this was some 20 more years ago. He said, the situations and issues we're dealing with are of such complexity that no one person can really come forward with the idea. But let me go in another way, though. I think one of the things is going to be the lessons learned. Right? And, I have a publisher, he will know it because he was part of that edited book with Lynn Reiner, and she's one of my publishers who dealt with it. She did an edited book on state conflict and democracy. I have a proposal floating through my mind, and that proposal is going to be exactly your question. And that question is, what have been the lessons that we have learned? In my case, I could talk specifics. I could talk about the Liberian experience and getting in there, what you're able to do and what accomplished it. And you could see what has been accomplished, right, in it. And we were very good. I could talk about Zambia. And right now, one of my sons is in Zambia with two of his children, and who are, having that experience of being there. But I've seen, being able to go in Zambia, get involved in Zambia, with the transition from a, single party rule, Kenneth Kaunda, and then to stay with that situation. And now you have a real lead in terms of democracy building. So we can see those cycles, but we can also see countries that are going the other way. I mean, what is happening in Ghana? Ghana was one of the great achievements in terms of that war. And then, the president just stepped aside and he left Ghana with a big hole in Accra to build a cathedral. It's like, it's like insanity. Okay? Or the Ivory Coast, which has been one of the most successful cases. And the recent president who came in, and then I saw a program with his challenger. And then they're doing everything to exclude him, from being able to compete. Right? You see these things being repeated. So I'm sorry, the only thing I can say is, we've been there before. We've done it again. You pick yourself up, and you just get in there. One of President Carter's statements, he said, "I'm not afraid to fail." There is going to be failure, but it's also going to be recovery. Thank you.
Dara, do you want to read one from online, and then we'll turn to you, sir?
Sure, I'm trying to decide which one. I'm just gonna go in order because that's the easiest way to do it. So another one, thanking you again for being here and saying you remain an inspiration for them and many others. They have a question about governance as it relates to Africa. Mustaf Khan has been talking about political settlement and growth enhancing institutions. Some people believe that corruption is inevitable and that how to use it to foster growth is what matters. Their question is, to what extent can corruption foster growth in a rentier economy like Nigeria and several other dependent countries in Africa?
Well, let's put it this way. Next February of 2026, will be a half century of my engagement with Nigeria. And during that period, I have yet to see how corruption fosters growth or can be part of it. I cannot see it. You know, I mean, it's sad, you know, to see it. And to get back to your question from, you know, I put it in my notes, the ID question, right? Imolayo Daramola question. What are the concrete steps? She said specific steps are needed, you know, and how break free. How do we break free from this? Right? And in fact, you know, in 2023, in June of 2023, at New College, they had a colloquium around, you know, my thoughts, my thinking about this. And one of the ideas is of nodes, you know, nodes of good governance and institution building. I mean, just practically identifying. I've made that suggestion. I mean, again, coming back to next year, which is, you know, outstanding global institution on public policy, right, that we have. And basically, and we have Ashe University in Ghana, led by Patrick Awuwa and another colleague. But anyways, being able to look at those institutions, not sort of, you know, hypothetically, but real actual institutions, and being able to say, okay, tell us how you did it, right? I have a colleague at Northwestern in sociology, Monica Prasad, who works on this very issue of how do you build institutions of integrity and efficiency, right? And again, getting the young people involved in this. You know, I skipped over different parts of my talk because I have ideas, moments when I really put my best thoughts into this. One was accelerating the creation of enterprise societies. I was at Brookings. I said, listen, you have this. Here it is, right? At the now, unfortunately, United States Institute of Peace, right? I'm seeing what's going on. But I said, listen, we still get back to this institution. So I came up with a name for it. I call it amplifying voices for institutional development. We need to get new voices, like the Daramola who comes in, right? And say to them, listen, you need to come in ourselves and let us hear your voices, right? We've been hearing the same voices. In fact, just a day or two ago, I opened up one of my emails that I don't use very often, and there was somebody writing me, saying, "Dear Professor Joseph, and I'm doing a doctoral study, and you're one of the, you know, you're one of the pioneers on this issue of governance. Can I do an interview with you on this?" And my response to him was, look, everything I've thought about it is available. You don't need my voice, right, on this. What you need to do is we need to bring in some fresh voices on this, you know, and find out some fresh paths, some fresh approaches, all right? So, you know, I'm sorry, that is my answer, especially on something to which I, like you said, I told President Carter, no, governance is the most potential issues. And here I am, you know, a few decades later, and you ask me the same question, and I have to say, sorry, you know, there have been breakthroughs, but there have been a lot of breakdowns. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
One of the things, well,
Yes.
my Trinidadian friend, my father was the first Prime Minister of Grenada. You probably know my father, and Decima Williams said hello to you, so she's listening online. One of the things, as you talk about voices, one of the things that seems to be part of what's happening right now is this notion of erasure. Of erasure.
Erase, that's erasing.
Erasing.
Yes,
erasing
absolutely.
The voices of those who have contributed to American exceptionalism and American excellence and have been not only participating in the idea of the American dream, but fully contributed to it in significant ways. What are the ways and the models and the collaborations that need to come together in order to confront this notion of erasure?
Yeah, let me answer you a couple of questions there. Let me just go back where you started about Grenada. You I was, as I mentioned, I was born in Trinidad. And I have a photograph of us leaving Trinidad at the airport. And here I was, before we got on that plane, I was a colonial subject, British colonial subject. And upon arrival in the United States, upon setting foot in the United States, I was an American citizen because I had the right to citizenship by derivation from my parents' citizenship. But anyway, it was something interesting to find out. Not only do I still have Trinidad citizenship, access to Trinidad citizenship by birth, but I also have rights of citizenship in Grenada from my father. Concrete. Okay, so you're talking to me as a fellow citizen here. But anyway, but the Caribbean, but two things. So the Caribbean and Africa are very, very significant. Sometimes I'm asked, how do you explain your involvement, your engagement with Africa? What is it, And the fact is, well, I was born into this. This was, this is the societies into which I'm born. And so, so many areas of connection, not to mention, our leaders, especially my Prime Minister, Eric Williams, and so on. But I wanted this thing you mentioned about erasure. I made a quip, just a little, but it's not funny. I thought of people who were invited to join this administration, that they all come with these boxes, and in their boxes is an erasure, for erasing. And the higher up the position you go, is the bigger the erasure that you need to be able to pull out. What are you gonna be, and so I think of people just furiously sort of scrubbing. We even had words being scrubbed. Here are all these words you can't use, And you have Cruz, saying, Senator Cruz had this whole list of words for grants, and they said, yeah, all those grants, we're gonna cancel it. And then it turned out they canceled, biodiversity. And say, hey, wait a second, what's that about? So I'm saying, yeah, it is this idea of erasing history. And this is why the archives and the narratives are so very important, right? And which, this is why I was taking you all through some of this historical narrative. Because what's taking place is a lot of this erasing of this issue, this narrative of erasure. So, yes, this is going to be part of the project, is us being able to really step forward and be able to say concretely what has really happened, what has been doing, and also finding ways to encourage. I mean, here it is again, Angela and her project with the young people. It's them getting the opportunity themselves, not only to be, learning about it, but them really understanding their role of really, Professor Osagi has this wonderful term, for collaborative, which is co-creation, that they can get into the process of creating, right? Knowledge, right? Knowledge about the past, knowledge about the present. So sorry to go on, but very intriguing ideas.
Sorry, do you have another question online?
There are more online. I know there's more in here too, so I'll read the next one though.
Okay.
Just kind of background to it. Democratic disillusionment in many African countries preceded Trump and the shuttering of USAID and other American democracy promoting entities and initiatives. This disillusionment with democracy stems from a critical error in the moment of democratization, the coupling of democracy and development, the notion that democracy would improve citizens' lives and bring about qualitative, measurable development. This simply has not panned out, and so even before Trump and the rise of authoritarianism in Europe, America, and across the world, democracy was already troubled in Africa. How can we respond to this organic disillusionment with democracy that may have created a receptive audience in Africa for the hollowing out of USAID, as well as sympathies for Trumpian and other kinds of authoritarianism? It's long.
As you all can tell, there's a lot packed into that question. And, there's a, publication that the African governance project was involved in, was called Africa Demos Monitoring and so on, as well as contributing, to actual democratic transfer. So let me try to gotta sort of go into the nub of it. And this is, yes, an Afrobarometer, I want to call them out and the important work that they have done. But I want to get to the nub of it. And the nub of it is, yes, there is democratic, but I don't even want to say that. There's disillusionment with what has been done in the name of democracy. Okay? Wole Soyinka, the well-known, Nobel laureate author, once said that the African people have always approached democracy, but elites have always pushed them back. In other words, that the demand when for a democratic system in its fullest sense, right, has always been there, and it's still there, right? But what the systems that have seen, because the way in which, again, I don't want to make this too much of an academic lecture, but when I arrived in Nigeria, right, and I'd done my work on Cameroon, and I had to do a second, I did do a second book on Cameroon, I have to do a third. But the second book on Cameroon was about Cameroon under Ahmadu Ahidjo, under the leadership. So when I got to Nigeria, and here was a country in which people were speaking, you could read the newspaper, what's going on. It was under military government, but it moving towards it, right? And then I was able to be part of that process. But while doing that, I was realizing that there are these constitutional and other rules being put in place, but it was a way of doing things that I saw was really going to be undermining that. That's where my whole notion of prebendalism comes in. And that's why the title of the book is Democracy and Prebendal Politics, right? You can aspire to democracy, but if the system is one of the appropriating of state offices and then using it for personal benefits and so on, well, the two are going to be in contradiction, right? And so this is why, if you want to have, and I want to, there's something that, I've noted from that question that I'm going to get to, but if you're going to want to have a democracy that serves the people, right? That is a democracy that is really a democracy that is, builds a state, the res publica in terms of the state, then you have to find ways at the same time of tackling those issues. These are not two separate issues. Okay, let's do a democracy and then we'll fix all these issues. You got to do them together, right? But let me get to this very intriguing point that was made by the person with that question, namely that the failures in democracy have somehow facilitated the elimination of USAID and other institutions. That's a tough one. It's a really tough one. Because the people, they were so dedicated. My heart goes out. I think of some of my colleagues who have given all of their heart and everything to this and see it pulled away. Okay? But I don't think that is true. I really don't think that that USAID and the other institutions, the sweeping of them away was somehow legitimized by the feelings that things haven't worked out as we would like. And let me be very specific. All right. There's a person who was appointed to create this agency in Washington that has gone about the whole process of the elimination and so on. And you all know who he happens to be. That person actually said, National Endowment of Democracy is evil. What's that? Where's that coming from? I mean, what's that about? That's not coming from, African people's, dissatisfaction and so on. That's coming from somewhere else. Okay. And I'll share with you something today. The moment, there's a moment when you realize that, that you have to do something. And I tell you know what my moment is with all of this? My moment, I've had 2 periods, United States Institute of Peace as a fellow there. I was a fellow there in 2002, 2003, okay? And, and that's when I did, a paper, Smart Partnerships for African Development, was I did there. And then I had another experience in 2022, 2023. When I saw that picture of Ambassador George Moose.
Here are some images of when I saw that from the web.
When I saw that, that photograph of Ambassador George Moose, who was the interim president of USIP, and he was previously the chairman of the board of USIP. And this is a very distinguished American ambassador, all right? And when I saw him being turned away from entering the building, and seeing the people who were sent to do that, it was like, just utterly chilling, right? And when you had a spokesperson from the administration, when asked about it, said George Moose, just a career bureaucrat. And when you think of the number of times somebody who served as a US ambassador in a number of positions had to get out and speak about what the United States represents and what it was for and all of it, right? There's another word that I saw one person use, and it is, in that word, it's not just destruction, dismantling, all of it. Desecration. Desecration, right? And if you have something like the United States Institute of Peace, I remember the conversations about why you're calling United States Institute of Peace and not for peace. All the careful thought that went into it, all the work that went into acquiring that building, that space on the mall, raising the funds to put that building up, and all of it. But not only coming in, taking over all of it and so on, and then saying, well, all right, and seeing people having to leave, but also saying, okay, that's good. All right, but we got a building, we're gonna take the building over, what we're gonna do with it. I mean, folks, it's almost like, I mean, you might say dystopian, but it really sounds like it's almost like a different universe that this belongs to. So, let's stop here.
We have until 4:30, right? Yeah, well, we're at 4:30, right?
Okay, all right, so I'm gonna be quiet now. You go ask a couple of questions.
We can get a couple more questions in, I
I
think,
know,
and then,
I know,
yeah,
someone
please.
had raised her hand a few moments ago, so maybe get to that one.
There's a paper or a book that's been coming up a lot by a Harvard researcher named Erica Chenoweth. And she studied protest movements all around the world for the last 100 years or so, and looked for commonalities among all of them, and found, this is simplifying it greatly, but found the 2 most common features were nonviolence and the involvement of 3.5% or more of the population on a sustained basis. And I wonder if you have some examples for us in this movement of trying to make change from Africa, of movements that involved massive numbers of people, 3.5% or more of the population, or what you think that thesis makes any sense. And do you know of examples from Africa that kind of correspond to that? And lessons for us.
Well, all of the, transitions that I have experienced, in South Africa, somewhat directly experienced, actually meeting the leader part of it, South Africa, I mentioned Liberia, I mentioned Ghana, I mentioned Zambia, right? mean, all of these countries have evolved, really, and Nigeria, I mean, that Nigeria's had now a quarter century, it's not a perfect democracy, but that's 25 years of an electoral democracy and replacement. I mean, all of these experiences, involve significant engagement. And even, but it's not just electoral engagement. Let me give you again this, I mean, because what people are doing, Kenya is such an incredible example. I'm just reading a story. It's just terrible what's happening with the economy and so on, the mismanagement and all the taxes imposed on the people. But in the case of Kenya, which has had elections every day, where Kenyans decided, this is popular action, decided to start using the Kenyan flag. Because the Kenyan flag, I didn't realize this, the Kenyan flag was restricted to just government entities. Only government entities were able to use the flag. And the people started using the flag, in clothing, in handbags. In other words, they were reappropriating. One of my colleagues had this notion of claiming and reclaiming democracy. So you can actually see ways in which individuals are reclaiming their democracy, but even more fundamentally, reclaiming the state. You don't have a right to this, right? And I think for us, creating forums in which these kinds of views are expressed and in being able to, to discuss. And, I'm so thankful for you giving me this opportunity to share, because we are, thankfully, because of the link and the recording and so on, we are going to be able to share it and have this conversation, move forward, okay? But, believe me, if you want to looking for popular, engagement, in fact, one of my former students, when we had this celebration, and when she got up to speak about me, she said, Professor Joseph is revered in Nigeria. And, when she used that word, and I'm revered in Nigeria, and you ask, well, why? It's because, well, he's taught, he's participated, but the other thing, he's spoken the truth to power, and they recognize it. And it's not only recognize it, they realize that, they got to carry it forward. Okay.
We have time for one last question online.
I think we're at time, so
Okay.
unfortunately, I don't think we can get to all our questions.
You want to pick your favorite?
We'll have them,
There's
yeah.
another long, which I think we're at.
If you find a comment you could make, they can have the last word.
We got another one, but I'll start if we want to go.
Go ahead.
Let's see. What do developments like the democratic backsliding in the US and other mature democracies portend for the longevity and durability of democracy in the world? In their opinion, the institutions don't seem to be fit for purpose. There's also significant citizen timidity and reticence in the face of blatant authoritarianism and abuse of power. Should we be concerned, alarmed, run for the hills? Do you think there's enough pushback from pro-democracy forces in the US and the other countries where there's backsliding?
May I add a subtitle to that, because I've been thinking about when globalism comes to the United States. I feel that question really gets very much at issues you talk about in Nigeria a lot, about, when oligarchs, when ethnically inspired oligarchs use and abuse institutions for less than national interest goals.
Yes.
The impacts that has, I feel like we're kind of deja vu from your pre-mentalism book right now in the United States in some ways.
Right. That is part of it. I have a question, but I do want to just, end on this note. Having to do with, basically, which is asking, well, is democracy, is that a sort of, an eternal kind of idea that we have and so on? And, it's go PNM, shake your belly, say, oh, shake PNM, shake your belly, say. Balize was this flower, and that was a symbol of the People's National Movement in Trinidad. So as a boy growing up in Trinidad, okay? And the University of Woodford Square in the center of there, Eric Williams used to give it, and I was just a boy going there, right? So you're talking to somebody who came to political awareness aware of the world of politics, with seeing people, you know, claiming this democracy and carrying it forward. And I've seen that in so many contexts. So I'm the last person that who's ever gonna do that, right? Who's ever gonna think that, you know, with all of the so-called black siding, autocracy and everything else. You know, I think, you know, I think democracy, I think the desire for agency, for self-determination, right? For people, you know, being able to, you know, to have not only their views accounted, but, you know, to have their interests fully represented. I mean, those are not just words to me. Thank you.